Okay, welcome back, WRIT students. This is part 2 of my video series discussing the rubric for prompt responses. So in the previous lecture, I discussed the first 2 columns of the rubric, content and organization, and how to receive 5 out of 5 points in each of those columns. This week, I'm going to talk about style and mechanics, which are the other 2 columns. So there's 4 columns, 5 points each, and that totals at 20 points overall that you're trying to seek for the essay, for each essay. So if content is the what and why you are writing this essay, and organization is the who you are writing about, so the author and the original article, and then when and where your arguments appear across your paper. The style and mechanics would be how you are writing. So the content is the actual nuts and bolts of your argument, whereas style and mechanics are the nuts and bolts of your writing itself. So in other words, style in particular is word choice and sentence structure. Word choice in terms of how to increase the flow of your writing. So that includes transitions, but then also your tone. So that comprises the formal language that you're supposed to use for these types of school-based writings. The sentence structure aspect is also known as syntax, and that we will be discussing in more detail as well. But that also helps increase the flow of your writing and makes it easier to read. Mechanics comprises grammar and punctuation, so that includes, again, the nuts and bolts of the English language. So that's verb, conjugation, modifiers, prepositions, conjunctions, adverbs, all that type of stuff. But then also punctuation, so that includes the commas, periods, semicolons, colons, and that type of thing. So the mechanics, again, are the raw materials of the sentences as opposed to the content, which is the argument that you're making. So the how of how you're making your writing does impact the content and organization of your writing, as well as your style and your tone, how your writing comes off. So I'll talk a little bit at the end about how all these columns are connected and how they support each other. But for now, we're going to focus specifically on style and mechanics and go into more detail as to what's expected in those 2 criteria. So some definitions, and you should be familiar with these from class, or at least the sentence types we'll get to in a future week, but for now, within the first couple of weeks of class, we definitely discuss transitions, which are linking words that are used both between paragraphs and within paragraphs. Sentence types refer to the 4 sentence types, which are 4 different ways of structuring sentences based on different ways of linking clauses together. So the 4 sentence types include simple, compound, complex, and compound complex. That's one of the grammar units that we're going to be going over in the future. So if that sounds confusing, don't worry about it just yet, but that's what we're referring to as sentence structure, how sentences are crafted, how different clauses are put together. And finally, under the, or at least under the style column, formal language is another element that we will discuss in further detail in another lecture. But this includes such things as I statements, the royal we, use of the second person, which is you. So all of those are considered not to be formal language, so we're going to avoid those in formal writing. We also are going to try and avoid contractions as well as slang. So part of maintaining this formal tone as opposed to an informal tone is using respectful as opposed to disrespectful language. So imagine talking to your boss as opposed to crafting a text message or writing, a note on a piece of paper or something. So we're trying to be respectful as well as formal in these essays. Okay, so specifically under style, what is style? Style is considered tone. The tone of your writing is conveyed through word choice, sentence structure, and syntax. and I color coded those words there so that you can see which how we're going to achieve that exactly based on the different criteria that are under each column in the rubric. So under style, what skill are we trying to hone by achieving high marks in the style column? What skill we're trying to cultivate here is the fluidity of your writing, the flow of your writing, and how readable it is. So how to show off this skill is, well, mostly by having few errors in terms of, especially sentence structure, that can impede the tone of your paper, but also including variations. So, in order to increase the fluidity of your writing, you want to use varied transitions, varied sentence types, and also maintain a respectful tone. But so the three ways that we show off these skills is through our use of transitions, our use of sentence types, as well as formal language. So I'm going to go into each of those criteria in more detail now. So the first descriptor, which is the row in the column of style, is for transitions. So again, you can get a 0 to 5 points out of 5 for transitions. So a 0 would be basically no transitions, all the way up to nuanced and seamless. So we're going to strive for, as you can see under 4 out of 5, varied and relational transitions. That means not using the same transitions over and over again, but then also using transitions that operate in different ways. So that means not just at the beginning of each paragraph, but also in between, like during paragraphs, in between sentences, in order to move between ideas. So if you get a 3 out of 5, that's adequate, that's satisfactory. That usually means you just use basic transitions like first, second, or third. Um, if you have fewer transitions than even that, then you would be getting like a 1, particularly if you use the same transition over and over again, like and or then or but. Those are all common. Or also. I'm a big offender of using also over and over again. So when you're going through your paper to double check that you have especially varied transitions, make sure that you just check the start of every one of your sentences and make sure that you have some transitions, not, of course, at the beginning of each paragraph to mark what point in the paper you're in, but then also in between, like in the middle of your paragraphs, like in your, to link your proofs together. So that helps you get your nuanced and seamless transitions that we're looking for. The second row is on sentence types and structure. So that goes from no variation, meaning you just have the same sentence structure over and over again, to including all 4 sentence types. So that would be a 5 out of 5, would be the varied and purposeful use of all 4 sentence types. So using varied sentence types to achieve different ends. For instance, the construction of your 3-point thesis statement would be an example of probably a compound complex sentence, and being able to really nail the use of that Oxford comma in there is a purposeful use of that type of sentence in order to elevate your meaning and clarify your argument. So I'd say before we do our week on the 4 sentence types, getting a limited variety or even just effective is pretty good. If you typically, I'll underline mostly effective if you have some construction errors. So, like if you're trying to use different sentence types, but then they're not really coming out exactly right, or they're coming off a little clunky, then I might put a 3. If you have basically no variation at all, I would be giving like a 1 or a 2, particularly for ones that have either just, the same type of sentence over and over again, which is common because that's just what you're comfortable writing. But then also if you contain errors. So again, if they're ineffective uses of different sentence types, particularly for people who have run-ons um, or who um, have errors like of that kind. It was very articulate. Okay. The third, let's see. Yeah, the third and final row for style and talks about formal language. So I will craft an extra unit if I haven't delivered it yet on formal language, which is a big problem, I think, especially for first year college students, because you don't have a lot of experience writing in a formal way other than, what you produced in school before. But the cool part about formal language, cool, is that it does actually help you when you move into the workplace because you will have to, like, people will not take you seriously if you don't have a formal tone when you're writing things like emails or in business presentations or memos or reports or things like that. So this skill in particular will really help you in the future, particularly in avoiding casual phrases and slang. So I think I gave some examples in a previous slide, but I've literally had students write in papers that something is the GOAT, the greatest of all time, or yeah, I had someone writing about in support of an argument saying that this was fire, and I'm like, yeah, you can't like write in your email to a boss that, oh yeah, that presentation was fire. So that's an example of informal language or colloquial language that we're trying to avoid. Some other things to look out for would be, again, the use of we, you, or I. Instead, you would want to use things like one, as well as you're trying to avoid contractions. So didn't, shouldn't, wouldn't would be did not, should not, would not, that type of thing. So if you use, for instance, if any of you use the word fire in one of your papers, you're getting two. I'm sorry, but like, or like if you seem to really be trying, I would give you like a three, like showing an attempt to have like more formal language. But if you have consistent I statements, like I believe, I think, or like I don't think that Weinberg was right about it. It's like, well, that's not formal enough. It needs to be objective. It needs to be almost scientific, like very detached sounding. So yeah, we're gonna shoot for a 5 out of 5, fully clear of casual tones and phrases. Okay, next we're gonna talk about the mechanics column. So the mechanics is comprised of grammar and punctuation. So mechanics also includes how words and sentences work together to generate meaning. So the skill that we're going to be basically testing for by looking at mechanics is readability. So if you have lots of errors and you have a pretty loose grasp of grammar and punctuation, then your readability is going to be severely impacted. So the main thing that we want out of this column is an ease of understanding. I want to be able to understand what you're saying, and a confident command of grammar will ensure that. So how to show the skill of readability in particular is by consistency and accuracy. So we're going to try to be consistent in terms of providing, correct subject-verb agreement, tense consistency, that sort of thing, as well as maintaining accuracy, so by avoiding errors. So the three modes in which mechanics are going to be marked on are through language errors, grammar, punctuation, mechanics, and then argumentative language. So argumentative language also kind of falls under word choice. So yeah, I would argue that falls more under like a style thing, but in terms of mechanics column, it really is talking more about active and passive voice, but we'll get into that. So let's just move on. All right, so the first descriptor, the first row that we're going to look at is language errors. So again, like a lot of times, like I'll return a paper marked up and there will be a lot of red on it, and that's okay. Some of those are language errors and others might be construction errors. But in particular, in the mechanics column, language errors refers to like misspellings, punctuation errors, maybe you're like, yeah, like missing a period or missing a comma or missing a paragraph break, things of that sort. So things that can interfere with my understanding of what you're trying to say by missing something or maybe adding something that's not supposed to be there. So the main thing here is errors that impede meaning. So there's a difference, for instance, between a one, which is basically a composition with so many errors that it's basically illegible or unreadable, or a two where it's really hard to understand what you're trying to say because there's so many errors, between, a three and a four, which would be limiting the number of errors that impede meaning. So maybe you have some errors, but maybe they're easier to understand still what you're trying to say. So that would be like a typographical error, like, oh, you made a misspelling, like big deal. Or maybe you missed a piece of punctuation or used the wrong punctuation. Like those are excusable errors because I can still understand what you're trying to say. They're just a little distracting and they're getting in the way, but they're not like actively impeding the meaning of what you're trying to write. A 5 out of 5 in that sense would be any forgivable typographic error, like if you misspelled Weinberg's name one time and it was clearly like a slip of the finger or something. So that's like forgivable errors. So that's kind of what we're moving towards, and that's what the grammar and the grammar mechanics units that we're going to be working on are going to strive towards, is avoiding errors. That leads us to the second descriptor, which is grammar punctuation mechanics. So we're going to shoot for assured and sophisticated, or at least reasonable and confident command of grammar, as opposed to basically inconsistent grammar punctuation mechanics that render the text unreadable. So again, we're shooting for readability. We want our arguments to be understood, and one way to avoid that is again by being accurate as well as consistent. So the more errors that you have, the even if they're major or minor, there's the number of errors you have can distract from the meaning that you're trying to get across, to the point of being distracting. Whereas the less errors you have, the more readable and the more legible your work is. So that's what we're shooting for, is more readability. And finally, we're going to talk about language use. And this is different from the formal language that we were talking about. Instead, this is basically the use of language in service of your argument. So there's a way of writing argumentative papers that actually improves the legibility of your point. So we want, with the language and word choice that you're using, to consistently portray your stance and your argument in a convincing, assertive, and frankly understandable way. So if you're using language such as the passive voice, so not directly stating something in an affirmative and strongly worded way, and instead you're conveying your own argument in a wishy-washy or like less clear way. It actually makes, not only it can affect your content column because it makes it less clear what you're actually trying to argue, but it also waters down the argument itself because it doesn't make it clear what your stance actually is. So I'd like to find some kind of example of that. Like for instance, if you're spending too much time weighing the pros and cons of the author's argument, then it can distract from what your stance on the issue actually is. So if you use decisive verbs and the active voice, for instance, like argumentative ways of phrasing your sentence, argumentative word choice, and that can help make your argument more clear. Whereas if you use less clear vocabulary or perhaps confusing sentence structure, that lack of clarity can make your language convey your argument inconsistently. So hopefully that makes sense. I will try and talk about the active and passive voice when I talk about formal language as well. Okay, so just to recap, I wanted to show some of the crossover between columns that I've hinted at as well, because while you can, each week we're going to focus on different aspects of the rubric for the most part, there's a lot of crossover between these different units. So like, for instance, when we were writing our 3-point thesis statements, not only does that affect your argument because you're stating your central thesis claim as well as the 3 points you're going to argue in your main body paragraphs, that content of the 3-point thesis statement affects the structure of your overall essay. So that would be your paragraph. Well, I guess that would be paragraph sequence and paragraph structure. One element of paragraph structure is you need to have a 3-point thesis statement at the end of your introduction. So that affects organization. It also affects your paragraph sequence because your 3 main points need to be stated in the same order as they're given in your body paragraphs. And then following that up, you have proofs, which is another aspect of paragraph structure, but then that also has an impact on citation and the dialogic relationship with the prompt. So content and organization really do have a lot of crossover, but I wanted to show also how the content and organization elements are impacting style and mechanics as well. So like for instance, in the 3-point thesis statement, not only does that, here, I'm just going to add this in here, paragraph sequence. It's paragraph sequence and structure. But in terms of style, the 3-point thesis statement in particular needs to use a particular effective usage of the 4 sentence types in order to be legible. So that activates both in the style column, the sentence types and structure, as well as in mechanics, punctuation. So like if you don't use the Oxford comma in the structuring of your 3-point thesis statement, that can impact the clarity of what you're arguing, which is in content, and also what you're going to be arguing in the future. So like if it's unclear if you miss a comma in your 3-point thesis statement between your second and third points, that can not only make what you are arguing less clear in terms of your thesis overall, it can also make the structure of your paper less clear because we don't know what you're going to be arguing in your second and third paragraphs. You also are showcasing an ineffective use of a sentence structure, and you're also making a typographical punctuation error. So again, that's why I talk about the 3-point thesis statement so much, because it has such a deep impact on all of these different levels. Additionally, you're stating your 3 main points at the beginning of each of your body paragraphs. That's a paragraph structure as well as a paragraph sequence issue. It also engages transitions because then in each main paragraph you have to start first, second, third. And it also engages your argumentative language because you need to make sure that it's clear that you are arguing your main point as opposed to Weinberg, and that your point is in contrast with Weinberg or is a critique or an expansion on Weinberg's claims. So that again also goes with the dialogic relationship to the prompt, right? Proofs, same thing. Not only do they need to be in the same spot in each of your body paragraphs, but they also require transitions. They require varied sentence types so that it doesn't get monotonous to read your proofs, as well as the usage of formal language so that you have that argument. And not only is your argument clear, but it's also respectful. And you're not denigrating your opponent, the author, but instead are making a clear claim that expands upon or varies from what the author is saying. So that's how all these 4 kind of tie together, and that's why we give you the rubric so that so you can clearly quantify the exact areas where you might be struggling. So for instance, if I say something like, oh, it's not really clear what you're arguing in your second and third paragraphs, that's because then I can point to a specific part in the rubric and be like, oh, that's because you missed a piece of punctuation in your 3-point thesis statement, or that's because you used the wrong transition in one of these paragraphs, so it wasn't clear if you were on your second or third paragraph. Or for instance, you were using wishy-washy language and I couldn't tell if you were trying to state an objection or if you were stating your own point. So hopefully that all makes sense. So again, just to recap, the four columns on the rubric are content and organization, style, and mechanics. The first 2 prompt responses were mostly concerned, I was mostly concerned with marking content and organization. But as we go through the rest of the term, where we're starting to do more units on style and mechanics, such as on the 4 sentence types, on different language use errors, on formal language, that type of thing, I'll start to grade towards style and mechanics more. So hopefully that was a good use of your time, If you have any further questions, particularly about content and organization, feel free to refer back to that other video. I will post the slides online as well, and make sure to actually look at the rubric itself so that you have a better idea of what I have been describing. Also, make sure to loop back to previous prompt responses that I've marked and check out the rubrics once again to make sure now, with your full understanding, you know exactly what points of critique I was making about your papers. All right, thanks a lot, and I'll see you later.